The deception, is it?
Yeah, it's a kind of deception. Now, so therefore we say that it doesn't look as if this notion of time has nearly as much meaning psychologically as physically. It has a little bit of meaning because it takes time to speak, time to think, and so on. It works up to a point, right? But the physiological process takes time. We have all sorts of body clocks, and the thought is tied to that, right? And so on, you see. So it's not entirely meaningless, but there's not much meaning, right? You see, you can't say it's the essence, it's of the essence.
But now, before we said that the mental and the physical are not really that different.
Yeah.
But now we're making still a distinction of time in the physical area and time in the psychological areas. Now,
well, even in the physical, we could say wherever we get to something so infinitely complex that we can't find an order of necessity, it becomes dubious. See, in the quantum mechanics, that people are facing that. They're saying it becomes somewhat uncertain what the time is according to your measurement, right? So therefore, there's a limit to the order of necessity already in physics, but it still works up to a point. But in this domain, it's not working at all, right?
But there is a part of the psychological domain which we suggest now is an illusion, and that's why time doesn't work there.
Yeah.
The time with the self is of no use because the self is a rainbow, so it's really not about the essence. But is there another domain psychologically which would be more real, but where nevertheless time wouldn't work?
Well, it may be. You see, we could say that if we start to analyze the material process of the body, then time will certainly carry us a long way, as they're doing. But when we come to the mind, we say we said, okay, it doesn't seem to be coherent to apply time to this rainbow chasing. Then what about? But then we see the problem I mentioned, that this big puzzle, the past seems to be behind us and the future ahead, but that's just the rainbow. So where is the past and the future, you see, psychologically? Or even physically, you see, we can't really get hold of it. But we, nevertheless, working with those concepts, we can make some sense of this succession. But now, what suggests itself is that psychologically, and perhaps eventually, for the deepest level physically, that we can't use time as the basic, as the essence, right? But rather, the moment now is the essence. Because all the past and the future that we ever will know are in that moment now, right? That the past and the future are now, insofar, that namely, whatever has happened insofar as has left any impression is now, right? And our expectations are now. And so we could say maybe that is the principle, the starting point. That, see, you could make a picture and say, look, one picture of an electron would be that maybe it sort of flashes into existence and out so fast that when picked up in the usual equipment, it looks continuously existent, right? And it might have a certain regularity so that it appears to obey an order of necessity. But it might be that it's basically created. But then it may create, the creative act may create this order of necessity. Right?
Would that mean then that any time that we escape from the now, we are applying undue force, trying to make it necessary?
Well, yes. Well, we're trying to push the order of necessity into the time order. You see, we're trying to make a change in this order, but we haven't got any. We're in an area where that sort of abstraction or that sort of representation can't work, right? And you see, even in physics, we have to admit that this was always a representation, but the actual experience was always now, right?
So any escaping from the now would be disorder, incoherence, and violence.
Yeah, well, you see, but we'll find, you see, that what this escape amounts to is that this past, which has left all these reflexes, has affected our perception very strongly, so that we see it differently, right? We don't see the now as anything more than a flash between, in this time, right?
So is there a difference between necessity in the order of succession and necessity in the moment?
Yeah, well, maybe the necessity in the moment, I would suggest, is that kind of creative necessity which we talked about in relation to art. That within the contingency there is a creative act, right? And that but then in matter the creation is recreation again and again, similar but different, right? Similar enough so that this form holds, right? But in the psychic domain, this similarity doesn't hold except in thought, right? Because thought being based on memory is just the thing that tries to hold that similarity. And memory has a base in the material process, and the material process is able to carry the similarity. Is that clear what I mean? It makes a record. Is that clear?
The past, the present, and the future is in one motion.
Yeah.
And I visualize it if you slow down a step, if you take a step forward and you slow it down, and it's a movement of past, present, future, but it's one movement.
Yeah, it's one movement, and it may be that the movement is basically creative in the sense that from just as we talked about insight or creativity, from this total source beyond, like when we talked about the emptiness containing all this energy, that there is a source beyond this level of matter from which the creativity emerges, right? And producing similarity and difference. And that if you pick up in a certain mode of perception, picking up a certain part of this process will create a sense of continuity, right? So just as with films, you see, with cine camera, a series of somewhat different images, when they're close together, and the brain does not distinguish images that are more than a tenth or so of a second apart, and therefore a lot of these images are together and they're sensed as a continuity. Or if you say a lot of grains of flowing sand look like water, continuous. Right? So therefore you could say that this continuity may arise from thought, right? Which puts it all together.
So we're saying that in the psychological domain, the continuity is non-existent and only created by thought, distinct from the material realm where continuity does seem to exist because of the arising of similarity.
Yeah, that's right. In the psychological domain, what continuity exists is held by thought, right? Now, not very coherently.
So the difference between the psychological and the physical domains is just this infinite complexity?
Yeah, that's more or less. It's far more subtle and complex, you see. And maybe the depth of the physical domain is equally subtle and complex, right? You see. So that's the suggestion, you see. We're now drawing inferences and making suggestions to consider, you see. Now, the thing would be now that this ties with thought, because you see, for example, when we discuss the observer and the observed being separate, see, with a space between them, that's in the image, right? Now that would imply that there would be time to act on the, see, it would take some time to cross the space, and there would be enough independence of the observer so that he could think about it a little while and then do something, right? Do you see? Having that space and time. But if that is just simply an image, but in fact it's all one thought process, whatever you call the observer has already been affected by the thing he wants to observe. Namely, if he wants to observe anger, he's already been affected by anger in a distorted way, right? So he hasn't got any time, right? There's no space and there's no time, right? There's nothing but thought, right, which has been affected by anger. And that requires an insight, which would free the whole process. So see, wherever there is a certain space and a certain independence, that leaves the possibility of taking time, and in the physical sense, right, where it makes sense. See, if something is the further away something is, the more time you've got to deal with it, right? The more time you have to think and so on. So, and in the physical sense, that coheres, it works coherently. But in the thought process, the thing is so wound together, and involved and folded together, that there isn't that time, you see. And there isn't that space.
But it's more like what you said, that Leibniz had the idea of spaces, the coexistence. In a way, in the moment the things coexist. And if you would have like the insight in the moment, then would it then be that you would have a new kind of coexistence, that everything would move together?
Yeah, it would coexist in a coherent way, creatively. You see, that would be the suggestion. Now, yes, well, now, so I think that all of this, what suggests itself now, all of this might also have to arise in the collective context of a dialogue, right? Now, that we wouldn't get into that right away, probably, but if we're able to sustain this dialogue, we say properly, then people might get into that too, you see, and experiencing together time differently and so on, you see. And I think all of that is open, but I think what we need to do about that is, to begin to, the same way as we deal with anger, you see, we have to begin to see how our experience of time is affected by thought, right? In other words, find those thoughts which are affecting your way of sensing time, and putting them in words, and you see, observing carefully. You see that begin to get into it. You see that to see that time, which seems to be there of its own accord without thought, would not be there without thought. Not psychological time. No time would be there, really. There might, and the point is if we could get an insight into this, you see, an insight, because I think that the liberation from this process of this incoherent kind of thought requires bringing in all these questions, including time, all that we've been talking about. That as long as we accept time and take it for granted, we will be constantly slipping back.
Is that because is time more primary than the self-image?
Well, it probably is. You see, I think that time is based on our whole notion of being able to order the world, you see, a process, which includes the self. And now, see, so suppose anything you intend to do and you begin to project time, you begin to bring this thing in, you see. Now, there's a place where you have to, and a place but then, or where it may make sense, but then seeing that it generally doesn't, and so on. And, getting that clear, I think, is crucial to the whole thing, you see.
Somehow seeing time as a misrepresentation of successions?
Well, it may be in a certain area a correct representation, but when it's extended too far, it becomes a misrepresentation.
Yesterday you put the question at the end of the day of what it is that could reach that substance, that structure. What is that? What might be that thing that can actually get to the chemistry of it all?
Yeah, well, that would be, again, perception, insight, you see. And that insight we've already seen is beyond time anyway, you see, that we've already seen that insight cannot take time, right?
Would I be correct in saying that dialogue is the doorway to insight?
Well, for insight together. I mean, individually a person can have insight, but we need it together, you see, that's what I'm trying to say. That because now the civilization has reached a stage where it cannot proceed in the other way. But in general, it would have been, we needed it anyway, but we now really need it, right?
I'm interested interested in what's behind this sense, like before you said the self-image, the I am had the sense of God-likeness, and the same thing now when you talk about time and being able, you know, if there's time, you have the control, the way to order things. It also brings in that notion of God-likeness. And I wonder what's behind that strong impulse to want to be, you know, God-like.
Well, I don't know. You see, well, I think that if you imagine that this image could somehow arise in the child, once the image arises, it becomes a reflex, then it's so exhilarating that the body itself wants to hold it, right?
Also, once you have an I, or the sense of oneself is separate, you're going to have to be godlike to get by.
Well, that's true too, yeah. But you see that the time, it ties together. If it were not for this notion of psychological time, there would be no meaning to the self-image. Right? But because there would be no time in which the self-image could do anything, you see. So it's hard to, I think it'd be very hard to trace the source of all this, but all of these elements come together and they form links which support each other.
The first sin, supposedly, was when Adam ate the fruit from the tree of knowledge. Well, now, there's no such thing as a tree of knowledge, but knowledge represents the self. That's what the self is, the complexity and depth of all of this. So actually, what the prophet said that was that when Adam ate of the fruit of himself, and essentially what we've been talking about is that, you know, the problem of man is this thinking, this image which is so faulty, and it's partaking of itself as the self.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, it's the thought is constantly trying to, you know, bring order to things and grasp them, and it would try to grasp itself because it sees that inferential evidence of itself, and it explains itself as coming from a source. You know, which is an image, and which has time to act and so on. Now, if all of that were not there, then these things wouldn't work. Right? Well, I think now that maybe, you know, as the hour is late, that we should probably begin to terminate this thing, close it. What?
To begin, I mean, let's just finish.
Finish, yeah. Yeah. Because, and we've covered a large ground, and I hope that we'll be able to proceed with it throughout the year and meet again. Right?
Right.
develop a very strong, powerful image as a competitor and project exactly the feelings that you want to experience on the inside, particularly in crisis. I want you to work on your breathing and come to understand how your breathing affects your ability to control how you feel. I want you to work on your muscle relaxation, on learning how to control muscle tension so that you are relaxed and loose, and you do that by contrasting tightness with looseness, tightness with looseness, in practice, in drill work, and in match play. I want you also to work very hard on establishing an emotional balance as much of the time as you can, clearing out mistakes, working on your rituals. Those are all legitimate areas of training. But if I had one assignment that I would give you, that I would have you work hardest on, would be to control how you're thinking in a very specific situation, and that is crisis. If I can get you to think about crisis, not in the context of, oh, why me? Why am I going through all this? Why do I have to play this person? It's windy, it's this or it's that. When your back's against the wall, when the world is against you, when you're not playing well and everything seems to be wrong and nothing's right, I want you to say internally, I want you to think, I love it. If you can respond to I love it, you'll keep the positive energy flowing. Tennis will continue to be fun for you, and you will be a competitive success. That is the key to a great competitor. The feeling inside of I love it. Okay?
It sounds great, Jimmy. If you told me all this stuff, you see, 30 years ago, I would have been a Wimbledon champion. I would now be retired, lying in the sun in Monte Carlo. Would have been wonderful, you see. But lately, I know all this stuff. I want to thank you very much. It has been most informative.
Thank you, Dennis. I hope it was helpful.